just sitting in your living room, binging the latest season of Criminal Minds. At the same time, you see a headline flash across the bottom of the screen. James Barber, the latest death row inmate scheduled for execution. This may seem normal, but have we stopped to question the impact of these media portrayals on our perception of capital punishment? As news sources have evolved to compete for ratings, true, unbiased information has been clouded by political agendas and reliance on shock factors to retain audiences. Mass media has incredible power in influencing public perception and opinion on the death penalty. Misleading narratives have perpetuated misconceptions, masked the horrors of execution, and ultimately shaped America's stance on capital punishment. I'm Larkin, and today I will show that mass media's portrayal of the death penalty has had an outsized and long-term impact on both America's position on capital punishment and the way it is carried out today. We will discuss three things: how the media has influenced public perception of the death penalty, how that same media has influenced our legislation, and the devastating effects this has had on our country's morality. But first, a little history on how we got here. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, in 1927, the first TV was introduced, and by 1970, 95% of households were tuning into their favorite programs. As television expanded from 3 trusted networks to hundreds of competing channels, impartial journalism has given way to sensationalized reporting in pursuit of ratings and advertising revenue. Capital punishment has existed in America for centuries. It began as public executions carried out in town squares, serving as a deterrent for potential deviants. In pursuit of perceptions of more humane treatment, these executions moved behind the privacy of prison walls, with limited audiences. The lethal injection became the method of choice after its predecessors, the electric chair and the gas chambers, were deemed inhumane. Despite these efforts, in the 1972 Furman v. Georgia ruling, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty violated the 8th Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. But this ruling was overturned just 4 years later. In a collection of cases known as the Gregg decision, the court deemed it constitutional, since it could serve as a deterrent. However, the fatal flaw in the court's argument was the underestimation of media influence on the public perception of the death penalty. After the death penalty was reinstated, mass media drove the primary narrative shaping public opinion. Researchers Lipschultz and Hilt found that in 3 Nebraska executions, news coverage was disproportionately in support of the death penalty, and often used provocative language when discussing inmates, claiming they butchered 2 boys, but described execution much more tamely, saying it was justice carried out. Although in their coverage of the events, most news sources did show protests both in support and opposition of the death penalty, they whitewashed the horrifying nature of the execution itself. This simplified and misrepresentative narrative created by news sources has continually increased public support for the death penalty and contributes to the desensitization of America as it relates to capital punishment. Inaccurate media portrayals of capital punishment also lead to misinformed legislation. During the Gregg decision deliberations, the court turned to public opinion on interpretation of the 8th Amendment in terms of current standards of human decency. While one would hope and assume that the highest court in the United States would have a rigorous process to assess what this current standard is, the court's ruling has been the subject of criticism. A few years after the reversal, author and journalist William Bowers developed the spuriousness theory of express death penalty support. He showed that the data used by the Supreme Court was misinterpreted and lacked enough thoroughness to accurately assess public desire. He conducted his own nationwide surveys and concluded that Americans did not necessarily support the death penalty, but rather desired a genuinely harsh and meaningful punishment for criminals convicted of capital offenses, such as life without parole with required restitution, which would benefit the victim's family or anyone else heavily impacted by the perpetrator's actions. His research tells us that America did not necessarily support the death penalty, but in the Supreme Court's quest for public opinion, the court did not present sufficient alternatives. However, the most important consideration in the death penalty is its inherent immorality. As courts seek to interpret current standards of human decency, they don't account for the lack of information provided to the public. Current execution methods are the result of a gilded evolution intended to relieve decision makers of any moral responsibility. The first method advertised as being increasingly scientific was the electric chair. However, electrocution's flaws became quickly apparent through botched executions. The lack of consistency with each use of the electric chair often resulted in horrible mishaps, such as Jesse Tafero's botched execution, which resulted in 3-foot flames coming from his head. Because of this, the electric chair quickly died out and gave way to the gas chambers, which also quickly died out as a result of large public outcry stemming from their use in Nazi concentration camps. The lethal injection is the currently preferred method of execution because of its outward appearance as humane and peaceful. However, the lack of research and collaboration with medical organizations leads to a high rate of failure, resulting in excruciating experiences. Its inventor had no relevant qualifications as a physician, toxicologist, or a chemist. He based his creation on his personal experiences, saying, "I did no research, and that I just knew from having been placed under anesthesia myself what we needed." The lack of scientific rigor used in its design is appalling, especially considering its widespread use and devastating impact. The lethal injection has earned the morbid euphemism, the cocktail, due to its 3-part composition, intended to paralyze the recipient, provide an anesthetic, and ultimately kill them by a cardiac arrest. However, since no qualified medical professionals are allowed to administer the cocktail, over 7% of attempted executions by lethal injection contain some amount of failure. If not administered perfectly, the lethal injection has the potential to cause internal chemical burns with no effect from the anesthetic. And since they're paralyzed, they are unable to express this pain in any physically noticeable form. Angel Diaz, executed in 2006, continued to live for 30 minutes after receiving the injection because the needle was pushed entirely through his vein. This resulted in chemical burns estimated to cause pain roughly equal to being pushed in a fire with no effect from the anesthetic, and the paralytic only served to make him unable to express this pain. Onlookers view only a paralyzed, seemingly serene patient, unaware of the hidden agony they may be experiencing. The masked inhumanity of executions has led to an oversimplified debate about the justification of them, without regard for the methods used. Meanwhile, most news sources continue to represent these horrors as justice being served. Although some argue that the execution of death row inmates is justified because the fault lies only in their own hands, this does not account for the high rate of error in death row convictions. Since 1973, nearly 200 death row inmates have been exonerated of all charges. For context, this means that if this auditorium were full of death row inmates, the entire first 10 rows of this middle section would be innocent. And this number does not even take into account the number of people that could have been innocent, but were executed before they could be retried. The fatal flaw of the death penalty lies in its irreversibility. Alternatives like life without parole still act as a harsh punishment, but also allow for the possibility of new evidence or other factors that could lead to an acquittal. None of the other common arguments in favor of the death penalty hold up either. Stephen Oliphant found that there is no evidence of a deterrent effect attributable to death penalty statutes. And in more than a dozen states, a single execution costs up to 10 times as much as housing an inmate for life. Sterling Goodspeed, a former New York district attorney, stated, "I could put someone in the Waldorf Hotel for 60 to 70 years and feed them 3 meals a day, cheaper than we can litigate a single death penalty case." In short, the death penalty is many times more expensive than a life sentence. It does not act as a deterrent. Even the most evolved methods remain barbaric and cruel, and the court's ruling for constitutionality was based on a flawed method because of biased media portrayals. So why is it still around? Capital punishment's continued existence is simply the result of biased journalism being adopted to represent public opinion as a whole. So, what do we do? In order to combat these problems, it requires a decisive response on a societal and an individual level. Mass media sources must provide more objective, fact-based perspectives, allowing individuals to make informed decisions on their own personal stances without partisan pressures. We need to be able to rely on them to expose the immoral truths of the death penalty. Each and every citizen has to make an intentional effort to verify information and look at multiple sources in order to ensure an accurate understanding of these judicial issues. Since the Supreme Court looks to public opinion on interpretation of the Constitution, that public opinion must be informed and assessed more thoroughly in order to ensure an accurate understanding. Or just get rid of the death penalty. More than 70% of the world's countries have now outlawed capital punishment, with more on the road to abolition. For a country that preaches individual freedoms and whose foundations are built upon justice for all, how, in our current modern era, do we continue to morally and legally accept the death penalty? Thankfully, there is starting to be a larger opposition to capital punishment, and the number of executions carried out continues to decrease. But until that number is zero, it is far too high and impossible to justify. Thank you.